Welcome to the University of Manitoba Alumni and Friends Virtual Learning for Life series, our fourth session of a total of 9 weeks. We meet each Wednesday at this time with exception to our final session, which is on Tuesday, June the 30th because of the Canada Day holiday the following day. My name is Tracy Bowman. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations here at the University of Manitoba and a very proud alumna, and I will be the moderator for this series. Today, we have about over 600 alumni and friends who've registered to be with us today from around the world. So thank you very much for joining us and making this event part of your day, and in general for choosing to stay connected with your alma mater in this way. This program has traditionally been in person, geared towards our alumni and friends community in the Winnipeg area, but we've expanded it to all of our 145,000 alumni living in 140 countries around the world to participate. And we've been able to offer this program free of charge to all alumni and friends, thanks to the very generous sponsorship of one of our affinity partners, IA Financial. Many thanks to them. Delivering learning for life opportunities is a very important role for the University of Manitoba, and we are proud that we're able to showcase so many of our leading professors and researchers in this way. So just a few housekeeping details before I introduce our presenter today. You are all viewing this webinar in the YouTube link that we provide, and you will be able to see our presenter after I'm finished my introduction remarks. Today's session is being recorded like our previous sessions and will be posted on our website in the next day or two, and we will let you know about that. You were also sent a link to Slido. That website is www.sli.do and a password, which is VL27. And if you're choosing to ask our presenter questions, this is the way to do it. You will be able to enter your questions, and then I, as the moderator, will be able to see them, and then I will make them accessible to all. And then at the end of our session, during the Q&A portion, I will be asking our presenter the questions. We will try to get through as many as possible, and I apologize if we can't get through all of the questions. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, who is Dr. James Fergusson, who will be presenting on the defense and security implications during a pandemic. Dr. Fergusson, a two-time alumnus, is the Deputy Director for the Center for Defense and Security Studies and a professor in our Department of Political Studies. He specializes in international relations, and his areas of research include strategic studies, methodology and statistical studies on voting behavior, and American government. And in fact, I was lucky enough to have him as one of my professors in a research methods course when I was a poli-sci student here at the U of M. So with that, over to you, Dr. Fergusson.
Great. Thanks very much, Tracy. It's really a pleasure to be able to speak to you today. It's a bit strange that you can see me, but I can't see you. Well, in fact, all I can see is me, which is rather strange. I should, as a bit of background, I've been on sabbatical this term till July. I come back officially. So I've been able to avoid doing these things, Zoom and all the other things, and I haven't learned anything about it, but I'm going to have to learn something about it and get used to it. So bear with me if I get a little twitchy or something, because it's just something entirely new to me. One of the things, as you know, when you do a public presentation outside, it's always nice to see the audience, is that you usually are standing up, you have a lectern, and on the lectern is usually your notes or your laptop, which you are examining as you go along with the talk. So I'm sitting down, it's very comfortable to sit down, but I don't have a lectern. So just so that you know, when I keep turning to my right, what I'm doing is looking at another laptop, which has my notes on it. So hopefully this will all go well, and I look forward to your questions when we conclude. So my topic today is defense and security implications during a pandemic, which is a bit misleading, because what I really want to talk about is what has happened in terms of defense and security issues during this recent period, and what potentially the future implications are once the world returns to whatever, as there people talk about, and I'll talk a bit about the new normal. Perhaps a better, more accurate title to this talk is COVID-19 Pandemics as a Path to Perpetual Peace. You've probably all noticed one way or another that conflict, crisis, war, which has ravaged the globe for many years now, which are ongoing and continuing, seems to have all stopped. There's a few, if any, reports of major clashes. If you think back to the conflicts that have been going on in the lead up to the pandemic, the conflict in Ukraine between the Ukrainian government and East Ukrainian separatists with the backing of Russia, appears the ceasefire that had been negotiated earlier seems to be holding. No violence is taking place as far as we can tell, or as far as been reported. Even though this is the height of the beginning into the height of the campaign season, where you would expect violence to work or start to escalate. In the case of the Syrian civil war, just prior to the breakout of the pandemic, the Russian-supported Assad forces were on the verge of basically winning the war, putting an end to the opposition forces, particularly the Kurdish forces. The Turkish government was intervening also against the Kurds, and one sort of expected very quickly that this would bring that war to an end, even though the outcome is not necessarily a good one for the people of Syria. But that came to a halt as well. There seems to be a nominal ceasefire, or at least we're not hearing anything. And if you keep going around the world where we've had crises and conflicts, in Africa, for example, issues in Asia, questions about Myanmar and the Rohingya crisis, issues around the refugees and illegal immigration, all of those seem to have just stopped. The world has stopped. And again, it's not surprising it has. Now, certainly some events have occurred, primarily underreported. To give you two examples from Asia, there has been the issues of disputes in the East China Sea, primarily between China and Japan over disputed Senkaku Islands, and in the South China Sea over China's claim to those as territorial waters. There hasn't much been going on, but it's interesting to note that during the period about a month or so ago, the Chinese sortied their only aircraft carrier and with a task force into the disputed waters in the East China Sea. It didn't receive much attention. It had no major impact. A few weeks later, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel sank a Vietnamese fishing vessel. Something, again, nothing new, not well reported. But again, nothing escalated. Everything was fairly quiet in the region, as it is elsewhere. We've had the recent report out of Venezuela of the Sulu Bay of Pigs intervention by mercenaries or whomever they are, backed by the United States or not. How true those events are, we don't know. But again, outside of those small little indications of issues, Iran and the United States still have issues in the Gulf and elsewhere. But again, violence in Iraq seems to have subsided. And although the Iranians recently stated that it would continue to use their patrol boats and their fast speedboats in the Gulf, not necessarily to harass American vessels, not much has been said about that as well. And it raises an interesting puzzle as to how do you explain the fact that suddenly, almost overnight, international politics, international security politics came to a grinding stop and are slowly now starting to resume in many ways. There are several explanations we consider. One is simply a media one. As you know, the media quickly gets possessed by a dominant issue such as the pandemic. If you look at the Canadian media, it's almost as the rest of the world, except for brief reports about how bad other states are doing with the pandemic. Basically, the Canadian media is focused upon Canada and their obsession with the pandemic. No different in the United States, in Europe, and pretty well across the world. It doesn't mean that events haven't occurred in some of the areas of insurgencies, rebellions, Boko Haram in Nigeria, for example, issues in Somalia. It may be simply that they're not being reported, that no one's really paying attention to them. So that's one possible explanation. The second explanation, of course, is that the attention of all government and every government, as it should be, is on the pandemic and national requirements, particularly as it affects the populations, social cohesion issues, and of course, the economic questions that all governments face. Governments are large, with large bureaucracies, tasked to do different functions. But in this case, it seems the entire government and the entire bureaucracy, whether in our case, federal or provincial or municipal, is simply devoted to one thing, the pandemic. And if we assume that this is the case as it has spread from China into Europe, then into North America, and then now into the southern parts of the globe, that this is what's captured everyone's attention, and thus no one has any time and no interest in dealing with other issues which basically have hit the periphery in terms of their political priority. The third is that many of the dynamics of international politics and international security politics, of course, operate in the case of being able to meet. The recent summit, although President Trump has suggested that he might go ahead with the summit scheduled next month in Camp David, it's unlikely to happen because I doubt if any of the major leaders of the G7 will actually appear. Discussions, for example, between the United Kingdom and the EU on the exit and negotiating a trade arrangement and economic arrangement between the two seem to have simply come to a grinding halt. Time is running out, of course, but if the elites, the diplomats, the leadership can't meet with one another, the various forums in which these issues, particularly in the security world, are discussed in terms of seeking management or resolution, those are simply not taking place. So that, again, reduces the attention we pay and, of course, the priority attached to it by all the governments. Finally, in terms of my particular area of research, which is strategic studies and the politics of armed force, one needs to take a fairly close look, it would seem to me, at what the pandemic virus, the COVID-19, the pandemic, really means for armed force. And armed forces, to give you the most obvious example, the USS Teddy Roosevelt, an American nuclear aircraft carrier, was hit by the virus and, of course, was then pulled off station to weather it out, if I can put it that way. How do you do the things that the medical professionals tell us, social distancing, wearing masks, if you're 5,000 personnel stuck on an aircraft carrier? Or if you're fewer personnel, but you live in a nuclear or a conventional submarine or any naval vessel. These are close quarters, and it just does not just extend to the naval forces, but air forces, army forces. If you think of the number of 4 people tightly into a tank, how then are you going to try to stop the spread when, in terms of forces, where it's usually are concentrated, all the issues that merge from trying to protect yourself from COVID-19, you simply cannot meet. The net result is forces stand down. Again, I'm not sure exactly how it's played out in Russia, China, and elsewhere, but by and large, in order not to decimate your own forces, you have to stand most of them down, try to undertake the medical provisions that have been suggested or recommended and required by the authorities, and you're left with basically skeleton crews. Skeleton crews, for example, in North America, to maintain your fundamental operational requirements. So in the case of North America, with the North American Aerospace Defense Command, those are the minimum to assure that that you're able to monitor flights, potential adversarial military flights into Canadian and American territory. These are, for example, Russian bomber training flights, which occur on a very regular basis, which seems to have been a bit stood down when they do approach Canadian or American territory, or what's known as Area Defense Identification Zones. NORAD then releases fighters to intercept them, basically go up and meet them, wave at them, smile, and make sure they don't penetrate our airspace. Those minimum requirements, and if you think across the board, are all scaled down to maintain what the minimum of security that is required. And this is probably the case with all the militaries, because if you have the COVID virus hit a densely populated military base, it's going to sweep through it, and it's going to have such negative implications for your defense and security that you have no choice. And this, I think, is another important explanation in terms of those, and some have feared, and some continue, I think, to fear that certain states might take advantage of these provisions of standing down in some ways, but maintaining a minimal level required for national security and alliance security, might seek to take advantage of it. The reality is they can't take advantage of it because the problem is one of a global nature. So that's sort of try to explain why we've had this lull in international politics and international defense and security politics. This, of course, raises that point that everyone talks about with regards to the impact of the pandemic, and that simply is what is the new normal? And most people, when they respond and they talk about in terms of social, political, and economic issues, respond with the answer, well, I don't know what the new normal will be, but it won't be the old normal. They can't predict it, but certain behaviors that have been long dominated, social interaction, people expect will change. Function, for example, of social distancing. Let me turn and apply that then to international politics and international security politics. What will the new normal be? Well, the answer, unfortunately, is not that the pandemic and its global impact, as some have hoped or suggested, might usher in a new era of international cooperation because it affects all of us, and the only way you can manage this is through cooperation. On the contrary, the new normal is basically going to be the old normal. It will slowly, over time, as all the nations recover from the pandemic, return to the basic issues which have dominated international security politics for the last 5 or more years. This is not to suggest to you that the pandemic, the COVID-19 virus, will have zero impact upon how international security politics are conducted and issues surrounding the threat and or use of force. It will have some impact. Again, this is where we get, as academics, anyone trying to predict the future, a bit weaselly. We can't really predict exactly what impact, but we can speculate that it will have some impact, perhaps on the margins, or as I would more accurately put it, that its impact will be to exacerbate to certain degrees the existing conflicts and crises. It won't generate new ones at all, but as I said, it may exacerbate and push them a little further as states try to figure out. And in order to demonstrate this to you or discuss this with you, I've sort of identified 5 key areas. One is the area of the defense and military security concerns. The second is in terms of borders and immigration issues. The third is in terms of global economic restructuring. The fourth is the product of a lot of these mixed together is domestic instability. And finally, the fifth is issues surrounding, which sort of loop us back to where we start, is future defense and security investments by all the major powers. And particularly, I'm going to want to talk a bit about Canada at the end. So let me turn first to defense and military security concerns. In a way, COVID-19 has brought something onto the agenda, which has always been there, but it's been very low. It's been like a sleeping dog. And this is a major focus, I think, that's already starting to show itself, particularly in information coming out from the United States. But I'd suggest, at least for the major powers, it will come out and be a dominant concern. And that is simply the question of biological warfare. To put this in context, as you probably know, by virtue of the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, states are prohibited from acquiring and using biological agents or toxins for military purposes or for use in war. What is not prohibited by the convention is the right of states to undertake research for defensive purposes in order to be able to respond or to ensure that someone who cheats on the treaty will not likely be successful. So this entails you need to acquire, research, develop different types of biological agents, toxins, viruses, trying to understand what their impact physically will be, and then in terms of that, trying to develop countermeasures to these types of agents, vaccines, for example. So this is one of the aspects that's going to come out with regards to future military concerns. What does, in simple terms, what does COVID-19 tell us about the potential for future biological warfare or potential situations of how the militaries will need to respond to these pandemics, not necessarily in the context of a conflict, but in terms of one of their major missions, which is always we tend to ignore, and that is through the provision of assistance and aid to civil authorities. So this comes down to 3 key important elements. The first is questions that have immediately arisen, I think, within military and defense analytical circuses circles, pardon me, about how states might employ similar viruses to advance their interests, including their employment potentially to paralyze an enemy or significantly disrupt its economy and its social cohesion. One might consider this to be a biological first strike. Now, I'm not trying to put any merit behind those arguments that the virus that came out of Chinese somehow came out of a military laboratory or the civilian laboratory in Wuhan, that was purposeful or accidental. We have no idea. It's a nice conspiracy theory, and I don't think there's much to be put into it. Eventually, we'll have some idea, depending upon the degree of Chinese transparency, about what the origins of the virus were. But nonetheless, one can think, our military's thinking always as they think in worst case scenarios, what does this tell us about the potential use of a biological agent? And one of the issues that it does tell us about, which the military, and not just the military, but national security apparatus will have to deal with, is the problem of attribution. And this is similar in a case, if you think of COVID-19 in a sense like that, it's similar to the case of problems faced in the world, in the cyber world, where national institutions, private companies, etc., as we all know aware of. If you want to go back to the presidential election, which still runs in the news about Russian interference, fears of Russian interference, for example, in the upcoming presidential election, fears that they were going to intervene in the previous federal election in Canada. One of the central problems is always in the cyber world is how do you attribute it? How do you really know in the complex world of the internet who actually did it and why did they do it? States are able to use private actors to undertake these operations. It's very difficult to connect the chain together, although many times the answer is one of a political decision of sort of, this is our adversary, so obviously they did it. So if you think in terms of COVID, it came out of China, that a virus could come out of a lot of different places and could spread throughout the world as COVID-19, we have very difficult time trying to attribute it. And if you can't attribute it, then how can you respond to it in political and military terms, if you wish to respond that way? That becomes a significant problem. This is a problem for intelligence agencies to try to sort out. But again, it's that certain key questions which military security people are going to start to consider and focus upon, something which they really haven't focused upon for a very long time. A very small amount of resources to it. So that's one of the important things. The second is the lessons that are be learned in two ways from the actual impact of the virus as it swept across, for example, North America or Europe. That is, as the militaries themselves had to deal with the potential spread of the virus within their ranks. And as I mentioned, they needed to stand down as much as they could, leave a fledgling or a sufficient enough screen of forces to ensure national security, or that no actor would try to exploit this. There are going to be specific lessons learned. And there's going to be a lot of attention paid to how do we then, if this happens in another couple of years with a different type of virus, another pandemic hits, how then will the military be able to respond more quickly and effectively? In this case, the military was no different than the medical sector. We've read a lot. I think we've all read a lot of the issues confronting medical preparedness for this, the lack of equipment, et cetera, and governments grappling with how to respond to this. While they learn all these lessons, so the military itself will also start to learn lessons, try to figure out what they did right, what they did wrong, and how then will they be better prepared, not just in the case of a pandemic like COVID-19, but in the case that this somehow does spill into the world of biological warfare, the fear of a biological first strike, if you want to think in those terms. So that's the second very important element to be considered here. The third is, as I mentioned earlier, is aid and assistance, or what the Americans call defense support to civil authorities. As we all know in Canada today, military medical official personnel are working in personal care homes. A recent report of the horrific state of some of them. This has always been a major function of armed forces, although it usually doesn't get much headlines. And for all intents and purposes, a lot of militaries don't like doing it because it's sort of not what they've signed up to. But nonetheless, we've had a long history in Canada of the Canadian Armed Forces supporting civil authorities. You go back to the Red River flood, for example, the ice storm, to a variety of other natural disasters in which the military are called on to do. Hurricane Katrina in the United States and the response of the U.S. military to it. So there are going to be lessons learned, and there's going to be a quick look. And this, of course, will have to be dealt with or discussed in terms context of how the military relates to civil authorities. What is the best way to manage this when they're called upon? And the usually term we use is second responders to these types of crises. So these are very important lessons which we need to consider. So those are things which is occupying the attention of the military right now with regards to COVID-19. One of the other interesting things is, and I just will point to other things of interest. One, in terms of the actual use of biological weapons, it's interesting because long ago, roughly almost, let me think now, nearly 30 years ago, in the context of concerns at the end of the Cold War about the potential fear escalated in terms of the rise of the terrorist issue to the top of the political agenda after 9/11, of the potential use by terrorists and others of chemical and biological weapons. Most of the major powers remained very quiet about it, except for the French, who declared that any biological or chemical attack on France would immediately result in nuclear retaliation. There's a set of interesting issues about those things in terms of trying to deter possible use of biological weapons, which are also going to be considered. Second is that there are now going to be resources available. Governments, defense departments, security agencies are all going to be interested in trying to figure out the biological puzzle, the pandemic puzzle, relative to security issues. If you go back to 9/11, one of the impacts of 9/11 and almost immediately following it was a large increase of resources that was funneled into dealing with the terrorist threat to North America and, of course, overseas as well. This was an area of growth for a long period of time, and it's difficult to know how long a pandemic will be an area of resource growth, but it's certainly going to be an area where governments are going to be looking for advice, expert advice, analysis with resources, which I think is interesting just from an analytical or an academic perspective. So that's the first point of this. The second point, as I raised, is borders and xenophobia, fear of foreigners. We all still talk a lot about globalization, but we're all aware that for some time now, border issues have been growing in political salience, even before the Syrian refugee crisis, but certainly expanded significantly by the Syrian refugee crisis, the flow of immigrants from the Middle East into Southern Europe, continued flow of immigrants from Libya, for example, into Italy and other spots. This, of course, was a major issue, which brought back in Europe borders. But it wasn't just borders that were closed to immigration. It was also the linkage between the border issue, the immigration, closing the borders, and political developments, particularly in Europe, but not just Europe. Many people will point out that the rise of what some people call far right, which I think is an overstatement, but a populist nationalist right-wing governments in Europe, for example, was partially or significantly attributed to the problem of immigration and the unwillingness of the EU and other existing governments to be able to deal with the problem. And of course, this feeds into this nationalist fear of foreigners, corrupting national cultures and societies. And this was a phenomena that we've seen for some time now, but now it's going to be escalated, it seems to me, or impacted even a little further with COVID-19. When you think about the way the virus spread, you think in terms of Manitoba, which we're doing very well. We closed our borders very quickly and set rules in for people coming from outside back into Manitoba. All countries have put those in. They're starting to loosen them up. But for example, from a Europe of no borders, from the Schengen agreements long ago, Europe became a Europe of borders again. And I think this is going to when you think about it, came from China, it came from immigration. This is all going to affect political considerations and political calculations. I should point out the immigration crisis is not the only explanation. It's probably only a partial explanation for the events which occurred in Europe, a partial explanation for, in the case of the United States, Trump and the Mexican border wall issue. There are a variety of other factors also involved in Brexit, of other factors related to local populations and representation and the alienation from the bureaucracies of central governments, or in the case of the EU from Brussels. But nonetheless, this is a major issue which is going to generate potentially significant problems. So you have this context of borders mattering again, borders being extremely significant, which will constrain the way political decision makers, regardless of what type of system they're in, but particularly in democratic systems, where the idea of open borders, free movement of people is going to be increasingly questioned. And of course, underneath those questions will be elements, this came from China, which will have a racist element underneath it as well, or at least be interpreted as such. And this is going to affect the way and the willingness of states to cooperate with one another, which will then spill over in some ways to the third area, which is global restructuring, economic restructuring, the impact on the economy. Don't work specifically in the area of international political economic relations, although you can't help but touch on it in the field one way or another. So I wouldn't try to present to you that I'm a specific expert on this. But it seems to me that when you look at what's happened, the shutting down of economies, the global recession, we'll see how far that goes. There are going to be some major, I think, impacts, but nothing new. If you think in terms of the context of what's occurred prior to now, in terms of issues that have emerged about the existing international rules-based economic order, the globalization of the world economy, with the rules largely established and set by the United States coming out of World War II. For some time now, many analysts have been pointing out that these rules are under significant pressure, and we usually will point to the election of President Trump. His decision to withdraw from the Pacific Arrangement, in terms of our own relationship with the United States, the difficult time in terms of renegotiating the North American Free Trade Arrangement, the United States imposing tariffs on steel, for example, to Canada, issues across the globe about American protectionism, which are rising. This has been generally interpreted as undermining the rules of the international economic order, which is primarily to open rather than close borders. And this, of course, then links into the previous point I tried to make about the border issue. What will be not just an immigration question and a tightening of the borders because of the nature of the spread of COVID-19 across borders, it will also then spill into the economic sector. And this is a major concern, I think, for everyone about how this will then play out after the end of the crisis. I should add, it's not simply about the United States and Trump or this administration's protectionist bent. There's also enough going on in terms of the Chinese abusing of the rules of the international order that has also been an underlying factor. And this, of course, relates to even bigger strategic, geopolitical and strategic issues regarding the relationship between China and the United States in this world of great power competition that's emerged since roughly for about 5 years now. So you have a different set of forces, and there are other forces at play among other states, but particularly is this idea that the openness, the attempts to expand free trade, to reduce regulations and barriers to the movement of goods, people, and capital are now starting to be eroded, and COVID-19 is likely going to have a significant impact upon that. Again, as I mentioned, I'm not an economic expert per se, but certainly it seems to me that given the nature of trading patterns, and particularly the fact of dependence significantly on Chinese production And companies are going to start to look in response to what's happened at the utility and stability of the existing supply chains. Marry that with a nationalist sentiment that's grown, that also falls out or is exacerbated by COVID-19. You now have a situation where companies may start to consider, and consumers may start to actually rethink their buying patterns, moving away necessarily from I will buy what's cheapest, and then that impact upon companies where they can produce cheaper. This will also then potentially, married to nationalism, lead to a willingness to perhaps change consumer behavior, thus increasing pressures for bringing production from overseas back home, which then will spring back on the nature of the global international economic system. How much this will actually happen is difficult to know. And of course, one of the central issues involved here is that this will not just have an economic impact, it was likely to have a major political and security impact. One of the references a lot of people sort of hint at, even before COVID-19, but I think we're going to hear again, is depending how the states, the international community responds in the economic sector, overlapped by the competition between the powers that have emerged. Whether or not we are in a pattern that people will point to that looks a lot like the interwar period, particularly an interwar period that led to depression, the rise of nationalist movements, bigger than neighbor protectionist policies, the rise of extremist governments, and of course, eventually leading to war in 1939. One should always be careful about thinking that history will repeat itself. But sometimes I like to think, and I should add to maybe the old saying, if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it. Maybe it's better understood, if we know our history too well, we will repeat it. And I think we have to be careful thinking that way. But you can imagine what might happen if the global system starts to break apart into regionally based systems with single dominant economic powers, the United States, for example, in the Americas, the European Union, in the European areas, China, in Asia Pacific, how this will then lead to or reinforce divisions or fissures in the system, which could lead to serious security implications for all the actors, is very difficult to know. But so that's on the negative side of COVID-19 that I think we need to be very careful about. And this, along with borders and immigration and the biological component, also now feeds into the fourth issue, which is domestic instability. All these factors seem to have ingredients to promote or generate domestic instability. Let me look at it in a variety of different ways. First of all, when this ends, if the second wave comes, or they say it'll be a second wave, when it comes to an end, one of the first things that's going to go through everyone's mind, and it's already present, is what did the government do and how well did they do it? For countries, stable democracies like the Europeans and North Americans, this is not going to result in dramatic changes in terms of the governments, but it will become a dominant political issue. If I'm President Trump or Senator Biden right now gearing up for the presidential election, there's no doubt the dominant political issue in that election is going to be how well did the president handle the crisis. And you think about this in other areas where there are already unstable governments, this is a recipe for concerns about how will the public respond in terms of the ability, success of their governments to manage this crisis, to meet the needs of the people and the economy, and how are we going to manage the economy down the road with billions of dollars in debt by everyone. What money is there for economic stimulus, which everyone says is going to be vital. How this is all going to play itself is going to be the political issue. And it can generate, and this is where we go back to the interwar example, generate extremist views. If you marry that into the borders issue, xenophobia, rising nationalism, all this is a recipe for pointing fingers at others as who's to blame. And this, of course, creates conditions which people always will point out in these circumstances, that unstable governments threatened from within will undertake actions to identify an external enemy and use that to deflect public opinion and public focus of hatred. And there's been lots of examples of that over time. And whether or not we are going to roll into a stage where this may start to occur again, which will be very destabilizing, because it's not just a national or neighbor-to-neighbor potential set of violent conflict or threats of violence, but also has regional implications and global implications. Again, it's very difficult to know whether the existing management structures that have in place for cooperation over the past, well, basically from the post-World War II era, whether they are sufficient, embedded deeply enough or not to be able to be resilient and manage the potential conflicts that might be pushed forward by COVID-19. And let me emphasize, not caused by COVID-19, but certainly pushed forward by how governments have responded is an important question. I wanted to also in this context add specifically to reference the case of China, which is perhaps going to be one of the countries which might be driven in a variety of different directions because of the impact of the pandemic, the shutting down of its economy, and more importantly, as an export-driven economy, the shutting down of the global economy. The Chinese, there have been some economists and others who have pointed out that the Chinese economy is a bit overheated. They have currency issues, which they've been able to paper over. And this might all be a situation now because of that changing economic environment as a function of the pandemic that would cause significant political internal problems for China. And if there's internal problems for China, there's problems for everyone in the region, including the United States and Canada. One of the central objectives of the current Chinese government, as they've enunciated for several years now, is to develop or grow the Chinese economy to a position of being the largest economy in the world no later than 2049, which is on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China. One of the central means to do this is what the Chinese have called the One Belt, One Road initiative. The One Belt, One Road is actually 3 belts of roads combined into one. There is the One Belt, One Road, the old Silk Road on the continent that runs from China across through into Kazakhstan, and then is supposed to, with development of rapid rail transport and other infrastructure, to develop a very quick, close link right into Europe. The second part of the One Belt, One Road is what's known as the String of Pearls. These are arrangements the Chinese have made with a variety of coastal nations, with port facilities, promising large-scale investment to develop their ports, for example, in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, in which they will then have this road, the maritime road, for the movement of Chinese goods as they are required. And the third one, of course, of interest to Canada, is the Arctic One Belt, One Road. This is the ability to, as a function of climate change and the melting of the ice, that China will be able to move their goods very quick, much quicker than it can right now, from China into Europe and into the eastern seaboard. All this hinges upon the ability of the Chinese to have sufficient capital to invest, to entice the various partners it needs through development, loans and aid and other investments in order to make this a reality, which is a centerpiece for Chinese continued economic development. Will the Chinese have the capital to do so? That becomes an open question now with the situation in the global economy and its impact on China. Will these countries be willing now to take Chinese investment because of the political implications that are involved with this investment? Another part of a Chinese strategy is to go about buying resources, foreign resources. This has particularly occurred in Africa, but not only in Africa, either in North America. What will happen in an environment of borders, of xenophobia, of deep concerns, the rise of nationalism, to the willingness of states to allow China to obtain access to resources, to buy up companies. This was already problematic if you look in terms of the 5G Huawei issue. But this is likely to be exploited even further, become a bigger problem. And if you put these all together and then you turn inside China itself, you have what may be called the threat to the Chinese social contract. Now, I'm not an expert on China and how useful this explanation is, but it's certainly one that has a degree of prominence. And it's basically the idea that there's a trade-off, that stability and support for the People's Republic of China's government, for the Communist Party's leadership, is dependent or perceived to be dependent upon the ability of the Chinese government to deliver growth, prosperity to its own people. And there's been, of course, a dramatic movement of wealth, expansion of wealth, people migrating into the cities, jobs, everything that has been central to Chinese economic growth. Does all this amount, when we think of the economic impact for China, the closing of the economies, a global recession, maybe a global depression, all this effectively undermines that sort of trade-off, if we assume it exists, which poses threats to the Chinese government and the Communist Party. We've seen in the past when such threats emerge that the Chinese government has not been reluctant to use force. We go back to 1989, and Tiananmen Square. And that, of course, in this era of instability, domestically, anywhere you go, rise of more authoritarian governments willing to use repression might be one of the other unstable developments. And of course, in terms of China, relative to the market question and all its economic issues, what does it mean in terms of how it relates with particularly its neighbors to the south and to the east and to the west, all around itself? And how will they then respond? So this is a real central issue that confronts not just China and how this will play itself out. And as I said, these problems have always been there. But the question is the extent to which the pandemic and its spillover impacts is going to really start to have even push these things more to the fore. Let me turn finally to defense and security investments, not simply for one reason. If, given the economic situation all the governments of the world face, trying to deal with economic recovery, the forces in terms of consumer attitudes, et cetera, that are going to affect how we recover and how quickly the globe recovers, relative to pressures to nationalize and undertake protectionism, it seems obviously that one of the things that's going to directly be impacted, and maybe a positive thing, is defense and security investments. To give you an example, Russia in 2011 announced, after reasonable recovery of its economy, although it remains a resource-based oil and gas export economy in principle, that drives, I think the number is roughly, accounts for over 50% of its GDP, which is already in trouble because of the dramatic drop in oil prices as a function of supply and demand, which the COVID virus again pushed forward. It was dropping anyways, but the dramatic drop that occurred, now we're recovering to some level. During the heyday, if you will, the Russians announced a major military investment program of near $100 billion over, I think it was over 10 years. I'd have to check the exact numbers. That has been derailed by the economic problems of the oil sector faced by Russia, and now it's even going to be more derailed. Concerns have been raised since last year with, for example, the death of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. It concluded in August after the Americans gave notice in February that it would withdraw. This was a treaty that banned Russia and the United States from possessing intermediate-range ballistic missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles. I won't go into the background of the problems, but now that's gone away. Fears that the New START agreement, which expires next year, this was an agreement signed between Obama and Medvedev in 2010, which put formal limits on the size of each nation's strategic forces. They can be rolled over for 5 years without the need to negotiate or ratify it, but there's questions about whether it will be renewed. The Open Skies Treaty, President Trump has just recently announced that the United States will withdraw from that as well. All this combines in the security world for a lot of people's worrying about this is on the verge of causing another nuclear arms race, which will be very significant and very destabilizing. Problem is, it seems to me that getting into a nuclear arms race is an expensive business to get into. And the ability of all the nations to invest what they plan to invest in defense and security terms is going to be significantly affected. And partially it'll be affected because money will be diverted into other things, into issues of the lessons from aid to the civil power and the COVID-19 virus, into biological research and discussions and developing new procedures and doctrine to deal with those issues. So you'll have greater demands on defense budgets at the same time that our defense budgets are declining everywhere. How this will then play itself out is difficult to know. The Russians may boast of their new development of hypersonic cruise missiles and hypersonic glide weapons, which they've been boasting about for some time now. But these may simply be derailed simply because the Russian state doesn't have the money to fund it. And this brings me sort of to end this into a conclusion of Canada. I can't help but think that the current situation facing the Canadian Armed Forces and the National Defence are very reminiscent of the late 1980s. 1987, the Mulroney government released its Defence White Paper, an ambitious spending paper which included the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines and major other military equipment to modernize and capitalize the Canadian Armed Forces. A year and a half later, because of the economic situation, that entire program was dead in the water. 2017, 3 years ago, another rather ambitious white paper calling for significant promised future stable investments, growing the defense budget, particularly in the capital sector, from where it stands today, roughly 1% of GDP, up to 4%, 1.4% of GDP. Well, that's not on anymore. The defense budgets are going to take a big hit. And it means very difficult choices in terms of the requirements for the defense of North America and for the ability of the Canadian Armed Forces to do its job or its commitments when it is committed by the Canadian government. And this will be another interesting factor which will roll back into this. And if you're in an area of potential domestic instability, military forces are not potentially also headed down the path, not in Canada, the United States, or most of Europe, but may potentially be headed down the path where their purpose will be more internal security than it will be external security. So this is an interesting time, I guess, in many ways. And I think I'll conclude now with simply making the point that all the factors I've tried to talk about or mention, and there are many others as well, but I've tried to mention, have all been in play before COVID-19. The real issue is not that COVID-19 is going to cause anything new. It's if it's going to push things a little further one way or another, potentially one way perhaps to greater cooperation, but I sincerely doubt it, unfortunately. Rather that it'll push towards higher nationalist sentiments, raise questions for all states about stability issues, and may push what are simmering conflicts or conflicts beneath the surface that exist, push them in a different and more dangerous direction. So I'll leave it there for now, and I'm happy to answer whatever questions I can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Fergusson. We do have some questions. So the very first one, do you think that the bordered Europe will continue beyond the pandemic? And will the pandemic other European nations to look at their own Brexit?
That's a very difficult question. For many of the nations in the European Union, distinct from the British, they don't have many options. If you think in terms of their rush to join the EU after the end of the Cold War, which was equivalent to their rush to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, after the end of the Cold War, it was a signal of economic prosperity. The Russian model, which had dominated, of course, was for political reasons, for a variety of reasons, simply had not worked, and certainly was not politically acceptable, which explained why its empire in Eastern Europe collapsed so quickly. When you think about where they are going to go or where they could go, that becomes a problem because Russia is not an option. It offers nothing in terms of economic development. They've developed their links in terms of economic links primarily into Brussels and into Europe, which is different from the British history and the British situation. So I don't see that COVID-19 is going to have any more impact than it already has in the internal political problems of the EU. And building consensus and agreement among the EU members has always been very difficult. COVID-19, I think in this context, about the differences about how nations have responded, who's been successful, who hasn't been successful, and why not, will have implications for solidarity on issues. When you think of the European Union's common foreign and security policy, which hasn't got much common to it at all, or their goal of a European defense and security institution as a competitor to the US-led NATO, all those are going to be significantly, I think, will be effective and will be pushed backwards. So if you ask me in conclusion, I don't think they have many options other than to stay with the EU. But what this does mean, I think COVID will cement or act as a sense of a barrier for the ambitions of turning the EU into a true federal state. I think right now all those forces, many of them predating COVID-19, will simply put this on hold for some time to come.
Okay, thank you. And so now from Europe over to China, the next question is, what are your thoughts on China's opportunistic clampdown on the democracy movement in Hong Kong? And what impacts will this have on world security?
To answer the second part first, I don't think it's going to have any significant impact, assuming that they do clamp down. It's one thing for the Chinese government to talk about new legislation, or the Communist Party to talk about new legislation to put an end to the various demonstrations, etc., that occurred after the attempt on the legal to extradite Hong Kong to China itself, undermining the principle of the agreement of one country, two systems. Part of it will depend upon what the final decisions look like, and I don't know what they're going to look like, and moreover, how they end up being implemented. It's one thing to try to signal to the more independent voices in Hong Kong that you're reaching a red line, and you should maybe back off, and we've tried to find a better way to manage this, to try to bring the center on both sides together in some way, rather than at some point where you would expect potentially out of Tiananmen Square that the Chinese will militarily or security forces intervene and put an end to Hong Kong. One of the issues for China is the importance of Hong Kong as a financial center. That would be significantly damaged, if not Hong Kong being destroyed by it. And I don't think the Chinese can afford to do that. Beyond that, there's certainly nothing that the West would be able to do if the Chinese decided to move that way, as we're nothing we could do with Tiananmen. But I think the last thing I would point out is this Chinese decision or discussions at the senior levels to undertake new policy approach towards Hong Kong is probably not just for Hong Kong. It's probably a message for others as well within China itself about the limits of protests and demonstrations. It would be interesting to know, and I don't know the answers to the extent to which the current leadership, and there are divisions, the existence of divisions within the Chinese hierarchy. There always are under the surface. In Jinping's dominance and life rule may become an issue involved here, and this may be driven also by domestic Chinese party politics. So that's what I answer. It will have an impact internationally, but it's only real impact if they actually move and act will cement those views already held by people, many analysts in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere, that the Chinese government is really an authoritarian, totalitarian government. It cannot be trusted with its word, and just will feed this view that China cannot be a cooperative partner in the global system, but can only be deterred and confronted.
Okay, great. And as a follow-up, and whether you feel you've answered this, you can let me know. It said that the person wrote, you said that political turmoil in China due to the impacts of COVID-19 will have major impacts on Canada and the US. Are you able to expand a bit more on this?
The basic fear is that internal dissent in China, domestic problems, as I mentioned earlier, within this general theoretical sense that this will leave the Chinese to lash out, that it will take a step further and not simply, for example, declare that the South China Sea is territorial waters, but it actually will do something to physically control those waters, that it will push a conflict with Japan, that other issues with regards to what they perceive as threatening to China's status will then become they will become then more aggressive, which will lead the neighboring nations, potentially push them into a containment structure with the under U.S. lead, which we will not be able to stay out of, I don't think. And this is sort of the danger that comes with aggressive Chinese behavior. Now, I would add one thing here that we have to be cautious about this. And that one thing I will note is that the Chinese have long been, since the establishment of the People's Republic and their desire to put an end to what they call the century of humiliation, which occurred in the 19th to the first half of the 20th century, of China's sovereignty, the undermining of its sovereignty by the imperial powers, that the Chinese have been always very sensitive about what they claim to be their territory. But they have not gone beyond that. So the other question is in terms of stability. So I'm not necessarily one by the international impact, but we'll be deeply concerned if domestic instability occurs, because then you create conditions where others might decide they have opportunities to intervene and do something about it as well in the neighborhood. And that's where the danger lies.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, what is the future of Canadian defense policy? Funding cuts, flat funding, or even a transformation away from combat forces to more domestic response?
They're going to face cuts. There's no doubt in my mind. Whether the current government will undertake what has been the liberal tradition in terms of economic difficulties and budgetary cuts, in which they identify defense, because defense is not politically salient to political fortunes in this country. And thus, defense took a significant hit comparatively than all the other departments, although everyone did back in the 90s, versus the Harper government approach, where they basically took a chunk, the same percentage chunk out of everyone. The only problem with defense was that the defense budget is the largest departmental budget in the country, in the government. So in absolute terms, it takes a bigger hit, but it will take a hit. You have two factors involved with the question of combat forces versus constabulary. Usually that's the term we use for forces that do a lot of aid to the civil power. One is this general sense, particularly in the military, is that issues surrounding aid to the civil authority, such as in the COVID-19 situation, can be dealt with and are best dealt with well-trained military forces. If you train your forces and invest them with capabilities to do the most difficult job, which of course is fighting wars, they also have the discipline and the organizational logistical basis to be able to respond to domestic. So there's a general sense that this is not an either or. The real question the Canadian defense establishment faces, one they've tried to sidestep for decades, and I don't think they've done very well, is there's always been a desire, and it's important to recognize what the government will do to defense is basically tell it, we are cutting X proportion of your budget over the next so many years. you figure it out. Governments don't usually intervene down at that micro level, not least of all because governments don't know what's going on and don't understand it. So the money then goes into, here's your amount, you do what you need to, but remember what we want you for in terms of what we've said, we may need your forces to go here. Because remember back in the 90s, while they slashed the Canadian defense budget, the Canadian Forces operational tempo deployments overseas increased dramatically. So the real question then becomes, given the long-standing desire of the military in Canada, the Defense Department, supported by a lot of academics as well, that Canada needs to maintain sufficient combat-capable forces across the board, Army, Navy, and Air Force. We're reaching the point, if this happens again, which I think it will, is that someone's got to make a hard decision that there are certain things we can't do anymore. We've made difficult decisions. Well, actually, we never made a difficult decision in defense. It's all been ad hoc decisions based upon where you stand in terms of the life of your equipment, for example, and when the cuts hit. So this is going to be a central issue for them. And what's particularly disconcerting for me in this situation is a third element. I think it's going to be a third element now, is that the Canadian Forces, Defense Department, even the government always tend to see the Canadian Forces as primarily focused upon supporting international peace and security. For them, the homeland is the aid to the civil power, and that's something, as I mentioned, they will willingly do, but it's not something they sort of really want to do. But there are now pressing issues in North American defense, and expensive ones related to the North Warning System, modernization replacement, the modernization of NORAD, and other issues in North American defense and security, where there needs to be significant investments. And that's one thing that might be the casualty, because it depends who you ask within the military. Where do you want to cut and what do you want to keep? I would suggest the Air Force wants to keep its new fighters and the Navy wants its new combat vessels, and the rest be damned. So these will be difficult times, but if the past is any indication, this will be done on an ad hoc basis instead of trying to come to a final decision about what we can afford over time and what relative to what our security needs really are.
Okay, thank you. Sort of a similar question is, do you think that international peacekeeping has a future? And if so, will Canada have a role in it?
Well, that's a real good question. You will recall back in 2015 in the federal election campaign, the Trudeau Liberals made a great deal out of the fact that the Harper government had deserted the UN and that the Canadian forces weren't doing peacekeeping, and committed that sort of the UN is back, that Canada is going to return to its peacekeeping heritage and dedicate sufficient, significant resources to support UN operations. Then what did we do? Well, we didn't do much. We talked a lot about it, but the government didn't do much. The best we could really do at the end of the day was to send a helicopter medical evacuation unit into Mali, limited to 6 months, and then pull it out as quick as we could. I think there's a lot of reasons. In one way that the government quickly came to a decision. It's easy to talk about these things, but you're then entering into very dangerous environments where the UN is operating. There's also issues surrounding, in many of these environments, you have the UN, but not just the UN. In the case of Europe, you have the African Union as well, the Organization of African Unity. I can't remember its new name, which is happy to have financial logistical support, but really is not interested in having Western troops in the ground because of the imperial legacy, even though we don't have that legacy ourselves. So peacekeeping, given the dangerous nature of those environments, particularly in Africa and elsewhere, are something that all governments, regardless of political stripe, are going to be very sensitive to. Relative, of course, to the other problem is that we have we have commitments for us, which are big commitments. For any significant military power, they're minor commitments. That's our commitment to forward defense in Latvia as part of the NATO combat groups, as a deterrent to Russia. and as well fighters deployed into Romania, also for NATO defense purposes. We simply don't, and if you put this in the context of potential domestic demands, we simply don't have the resources to do much more in the peacekeeping world. So it won't go away. There will be limited opportunities, but rather than what we saw, it seems to me, what we saw in the Cold War era, of fairly large-scale Canadian deployments into peacekeeping, we're now in an area where Canadian deployments are going to be 1 and 2 off, small numbers in support functions that enable the government to say, yes, we still do peacekeeping, but the bulk of our investment and deployments will be back in the world of our alliance structures in North America.
Okay, thank you. A few more questions left. The next one is, NATO was showing some cracks prior to the pandemic. Will the pandemic cause these cracks to grow and become more prominent or predominant?
Well, it depends which cracks you're referring to. One of the things you always have to know about NATO is NATO's death, the proclamation of the collapse and the rupture of NATO is probably occurs every 5 to 10 years. There's been no shortages of these cracks in NATO over time, and they're always managed and have always been managed by the realities of the importance of that security and political relationship with NATO. If you're referring to the references that Macron made about the problems of NATO and NATO being brain dead, those are nice, interesting domestic political statements. They might, in an attempt to exploit the deep dislike of President Trump within Europe, as to try to bolster the European defense and security initiative or policy, but they're probably not worth very much more than what they're written on. The French don't have the capability to do this, nor do the East Europeans have any interest in anything but the Americans, to be blunt about that. And neither the Europeans, the Western Europeans, or what Donald Rumsfeld called the old Europe, really are in sufficient state to be willing or able, now it could be wrong, willing or able to break from the US-led alliance for a variety of reasons, simply not least of all because they've underinvested in their own defense. It's getting more like us every day. So you have there'll always be cracks in NATO. There'll always be sort of implied threats. If you take the big one by the President Trump, when he first came to office, he sort of questioned, what's the point of NATO? They're all free riders. Maybe we won't come to their defense. Well, here we are 4 years later, and what has the United States done? Absolutely nothing. In fact, it's increased its presence in Europe over the 4 years. So rhetoric is not new from the Americans over those issues of burden sharing in the alliance. But as the allies seem to know, and the Americans know, they can't live without each other. So for the time being, I don't think reports of the potential death of NATO are extremely premature. And I don't see anything the result of COVID-19 that is going to affect the NATO alliance, whatever. In fact, probably it will drive, and a function of other considerations, as I mentioned about INF, will drive the East Europeans even more forward in terms of trying to push for a greater forward military presence on the part of the United States and the West Europeans in the alliance.
Okay, the next question is, do you believe COVID-19 and the recent mass refugee migrations due to, for example, the Syrian war, could spell the end of or changes to the Schengen area?
I don't know. That's a really interesting question, and it's sort of outside my real bailiwick. I was thinking about that issue in the past days. And remember that the United Kingdom never entered into Schengen. And its primary reason when Schengen was negotiated, it was primarily over the Ireland question. And the UK was able to manage this issue with the rest of the Union, no problem. For the core West European states, the Belgians, the Luxembourg, Netherlands, the French, the Germans, etc., those states within the Union, I don't think it's going to affect them whatsoever. What it may affect is that, and you already have it in place, of course, from the refugee crisis, that is that there'll be more potential states in Southeast Europe. The Italians will be an interesting question here, particularly if the EU doesn't do anything to really support its problem with illegal immigration. And the East Europeans, they probably will opt out of Schengen, but that's not a political problem at the end of the day, I don't think.
Okay, and the very last question is, how will this affect current and future loans from China on U.S. debt, currently over $1 trillion?
There's an old saying, and I'll probably get it wrong. The old saying was that I can't remember exactly how it went, but it's basically if I owe the bank $1 billion, I'm in trouble. If I owe the bank 10 million, they're in trouble. And if I owe them 100 million, we're all in trouble. The issue of China holding American debt, and although China is the largest foreign holder of the debt, they're not the largest holder. My last numbers, if I recall them correctly, the United States, the majority of its debt is actually internally owned, but China is the largest. But for China to attempt to manipulate that, and particularly in this economic crisis, it's basically going to cut off its nose despite its face. Because trying to make a run to use that politically in terms of forcing the United States to default or something will simply rebound back on the Chinese economy themselves. So I think it sounds nice and people think that it gives leverage to the Chinese, but at the end of the day, it's really a relationship of mutual dependency on them, or interdependency in terms of these that neither can afford. They can play on the margins and try to maneuver and use it as for political rhetoric purposes, but neither can they afford to. And remember that every decline, if you push this farther by the Chinese, for example, holding American dollars, any attempt to force this issue is likely to drive the American dollar's value downwards. In that case, China automatically starts to lose money. And that becomes a problem when you hold massive amounts of debt. So I don't see this as a major. This is something that will continue. And we shouldn't put too much weight in terms of what the Chinese might do in terms of their own currency. And one of the issues in terms of meaning the rules of the game is the Chinese manipulation of their own currencies, which the Americans have different problems with. But again, the Americans don't do much about it except yak. We'll have to see. I mean, I think it's going to be some economic impact, but I don't think it's going to necessarily be in the area of trying to manipulate debt holdings.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Fergusson. Those are all the questions for today. Thank you for the very interesting and enlightening presentation. We covered a lot of ground there today. And thank you to everyone for participating this afternoon. We will be sending you a link to today's session and a link to a survey where you can share your thoughts and feedback. Please do provide your feedback and suggestions. That's the only way that we're able to improve. Now, next week on June 3rd, our speaker will be Dr. Tina Chen from our Department of History, who will be speaking on China in literature, travelogues, and history, lessons for international engagement in times of isolation. So have a great week and please stay safe. Thank you.
Bye.